Good Tuesday morning. Welcome back to Begin in the Word. The text under consideration today is Romans chapter 9, verses 6 through 13, where the apostle writes, "But it is not as though the word of God has failed. For not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel. And not all are children of Abraham because they are his offspring, but through Isaac shall your offspring be named. This means that it is not the children of the flesh who are the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted as offspring. For this is what the promise said, about this time next year I will return, and Sarah shall have a son. And not only so, but also when Rebekah had conceived children by one man, our forefather Isaac, though they were not yet born and had done nothing either good or bad, in order that God's purpose of election might continue, not because of works, but because of him who calls, she was told, the older will serve the younger. As it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated." This opening verse is an important and critical verse for understanding the flow of Romans 9 through 11. It is not as though the word of God has failed. Has God failed because Israel was not redeemed? This seems like the logical question an Israelite might ask at this point in Paul's discussion. Paul, if you are saying that Israel is lost, that's obvious based on what we studied yesterday. If Israel is lost, then has the word of God failed? Has God failed to preserve the descendants of Abraham? After all, there was a promised blessing to Abraham and to his offspring. And so this seems like the reasonable question. And so what Paul wants to do in these coming verses is to explain that God has not failed, that he has perfectly accomplished his purposes, and that nothing that has happened in the new covenant era should come as a surprise because it's totally consistent with how the promise worked, even in the Old Testament. And so the first thing he says to that effect is not all who are descended from Abraham, from Israel, belong to Israel. You might say that doesn't make sense. Isn't the definition of Israel to be descended from Israel? That is, to be ethnically Israel? But he says, no, not everyone who descends from Israel belong to Israel, and he's going to back that up by demonstrating how the promise works. He says, not all are children of Abraham because they are his offspring. So there is a difference between being a child of Abraham and being his offspring. He says, not all are children of Abraham just because they are his offspring, just because they descend from him ethnically, just because they share his DNA, but particularly through Isaac shall your offspring be named. So for Abraham, the seed did not pass through Ishmael. Ishmael was not the recipient of the promise, but through Isaac. Through Isaac shall your offspring be named. So not every child of Abraham was considered an heir of the promise, just the one who was the recipient. And this means Paul concludes that it's not the children of the flesh. Being a physical descendant of Abraham does not matter. That does not make you a child of God, but you must be a child of the promise. If you're a child of the promise, then you're counted as offspring. And he knows this because he says, this is the promise. Sarah shall have a son. So not Ishmael through Hagar, but Isaac through Sarah. That's who God promised would be the true heir of Abraham. So Paul is setting up this truth that's obvious as you think about the history of Israel, the history of the children of Abraham. The DNA, the ethnic descent does not matter. What matters is the promise. And this, of course, is very similar to the arguments that Paul makes in the book of Galatians. And I encourage you to go back and look at our videos on the book of Galatians. But this continues. This wasn't just true with Isaac versus Ishmael, but even Rebekah. So going on to the next generation, she had twins through Isaac, Jacob and Esau. Just because Esau was a physical descendant of Isaac does not mean that he was an heir of the promise. Jacob was the recipient of the promise. And so the physical descent, once again, it didn't work with Abraham and his children. It doesn't work with Isaac and his children. But again, it matters who God calls according to his purpose. And he says, they were not yet born, Jacob and Esau. They had done nothing either good or bad. But in order that God's purpose, God's will might be carried out, God chose Jacob instead of Esau. And so God has had the pattern of electing who he chose in Israel's history according to his will. It had nothing to do with who did good or who did bad. It had to do with who God chose. Now, we're not here talking about the individual outcome of the soul of Jacob and Esau. We're not saying that Jacob went to heaven and Esau went to hell. That's not the point that Paul is making. We are saying that Jacob was chosen to be the recipient of the promise, and Esau, on the other hand, was not. We're talking about who makes up God's covenant people. In fact, we might even assume just by reading the book of Genesis that Esau, because he forgave and he accepted Jacob when Jacob came back to him and requested his acceptance and forgiveness, we might assume that that describes a man who has a heart that has been regenerated, certainly not a man who looks like he is totally depraved. And so we're not talking here about the moral character of Jacob, the moral character of Esau. We're not talking about the eternal destination of Jacob's soul relative to Esau's soul. We're saying that God chose Jacob and his descendants over Esau and his descendants to be the recipients of the promise. And this is clearly reinforced by the fact that Paul quotes from Malachi chapter 1, verses 2 through 3, where God describes his election of Israel relative to Edom. Now remember, Jacob is the father of the nation of Israel, and Esau is the father of the nation of Edom. And Edom was blessed at various times throughout their history, but Israel, they were the nation of promise through whom the Messiah would come. And so we understand here that we're not dealing with the question of individual election and who's going to heaven and who's going to hell. We are dealing with to whom does the promise belong? And the overarching point that Paul is making in this chapter is to say that Israel's status was not conferred to them because they deserved it. Israel's status was conferred to them because God chose them. He chose them out of his own sovereign purpose and sovereign will. And if God could do that, might he do something similar with the Gentiles? Stick with us. We're going to come to that in due course as we continue studying Romans chapter 9. Thank you for joining us today on Begin in the Word. It's my hope that just as you have begun your day in the Word of God, you'll live out today in the Word of God.